Hey Untold Radio Network fans, want exclusive perks and to support our channel? Introducing our YouTube membership program with 3 amazing levels. Get loyalty badges that level up to different cryptids the longer you're a supporter. How cool is that? You'll also get access to custom Bigfoot emojis and priority in chat. Upgrade to Backstage Pass for exclusive wallpapers, photos, status updates, discounted books, and merchandise. Go all in with the producer level for everything mentioned plus member shoutouts. Ready for an enhanced experience? Join now, pick your membership level, and let's make this journey even more exciting together.
The paranormal, UFOs, monsters, mysteries. You're listening to Talking Weird. And now, from a cabin deep in the Northwoods, your host, Dr. Dean Bertram.
Well, greetings, all my fellow weirdos and weirdettes. Welcome to Talking Weird on the Untold Radio Network. I'm your host, Dean Bertram, and up here in the North Woods, it's always wonderful weather. It's winter one day, it's spring the next, and it's winter again. So it really hammers home, I don't know what it hammers home, the weirdness perhaps of where I live, because this is a weird state. And tonight I have a wonderfully weird guest into some wonderfully weird, interesting topics that I haven't talked about before on Talking Weird. So this is going to be a fun one, and it's going to be something I'm really going to enjoy because, as you'll see, we've never talked about the Pukwudgie, which we're going to do. So tonight's guest is an independent researcher of the elusive and often maligned Pukwudgie, which is that diminutive forest-dwelling humanoid and trickster of Wampanoag folklore. Born and raised in Connecticut, her focus has been in the rich history of strange and spooky occurrences in New England. Her research into Pukwudgies led her to delve into the mystery of the Bridgewater Triangle, one of New England's most infamous high strangeness areas. That area has phenomena including numerous ghost sightings, Bigfoot, ThunderBirds, giant snakes, phantom lights, UFOs, and of course, Pukwudgies. She is currently working on an archival project of wee folk sightings. I'm going to have so much fun talking to her about that as well, and related phenomenon across this country. So I am absolutely delighted to welcome to the show, Susy Bastille.
Hey, Dean. Thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
I'm excited to have you. I had such a great night chatting with you the other night on Steve Ward's High Strangeness Factor. I'd never been on his show before. He's been on Talking Weird a couple of times, so it was a great joy to finally visit and to have you on there as well. We had a wonderful chat about everything from, I don't know, the history of flying saucers to Darrow to Pukwudgies.
And I have to tell you, we had a cold, rainy weekend, and I read War over Lemuria cover to cover this weekend. So that's your fault.
I'm so glad I'm responsible. That's the great Richard Toronto book for those of our listeners and audience who don't know and viewers who don't know, which is essentially about the Shaver mystery and about how Ray Palmer and Richard Shaver came together and were this dynamite creative force who somehow introduced to the science fiction community and the general readership community of the mid-40s this idea that there was these alien race living above the earth and some of them in space and abducting people and interfering with us long before, or a number of years before anyway, the emergence of modern flying saucer lore.
And yeah, I have to tell you that those two people would have been interesting had that never happened. Just by themselves, very interesting people. It was a great read.
I'm so glad you enjoyed it. I can't recommend that book enough. So what kind of surprises did you get when you read it? Like there are quite a few shocking things in that book.
Yeah, so I spent probably about the first half of it trying to figure out why everyone was so mad at Palmer. And kind of the conclusion I came to is that people have just always been the same. So now you have cancel culture
Right.
And you have creators, groups of creators going after each other and this and that. It was the same thing when you get into the sci-fi clubs that they had. It's the same thing that people do today with different creators on TikTok, YouTube, whatever.
It's sad, and I think you're absolutely right. I think you've hit the nail on the head, so to speak, because as far as I'm aware, that's the first example of an attempt of modern cancel culture. I'm sure throughout history there's been people who haven't liked things, but here was a fan group who was so angry with the Shaver mystery. They were so angry that this allegedly true story was intruding in their traditionally science fiction with, focus on fiction magazine, that they did everything within their power to cancel Ray Palmer and Richard Shaver. And perhaps they ultimately succeeded. If not them, the journalists who wrote about the scandal, like there was a piece in Harper's Magazine, which apparently really affected the publishers of the magazine, Ziff Davis, because Harper's was a general interest, very widely read magazine, which extended beyond the readership of the pulps. And I tend to side with what some people, I think even Richard Toronto talks about in that book, but scholars like Gabriel McKee, who's in the documentary I'm making on Shaver at the moment, makes the point of saying perhaps even more than the fan noise, it was that ultimate way that it seeped through into Harper's and Ziff and Davis, the two publishers who owned Ziff Davis and essentially had the final say on what happened in Amazing Stories, essentially told Ray Palmer, no more Shaver mystery after that Harper's article. So that was kind of the end of it.
Yeah. And of course, it brings up this book that keeps getting brought up in my life, Aaspi, by John Ballou Newbrow, who is a relative of mine.
Wow.
Like,
Can you tell readers a little bit about Aaspi and about your relative? Because that's going to be a fascinating story.
Yeah. So it was written, he said he wrote it by automatic writing. He said entities came to him and told him to go buy a typewriter. And when he got this typewriter, he didn't know how to type. And he just sat down and there were like hands of light over his, and he wrote this 900-page book in 15 minutes through automatic writing, is the story. And it's a little bit hard to follow. There's some crazy charts in it and pictures. But one of the parts that strikes me about it is that he says when a planet, any planet, not just Earth, is kind of ready to progress to the next level, these entities get sent to that planet to help them progress. And the entities are spirits of babies or toddlers that died at a young age. So this book, Keel mentions it, I think, in Mothman Prophecies. If not that, the Eighth Tower, it's one of them. And knowing I'm related to this guy, and I keep hearing this book getting brought up in these different weird circumstances, I called my mom on Sunday and I asked her, what do you know about this guy? And she said, well, I remember your grandfather's cousin coming to visit and everyone sitting around the kitchen table talking about this guy. And they said he started a cult and he liked babies too much. And I said, can you expand on that a little bit? And, she said, I was little. That's all I know, is they just kept saying he started a cult and he liked babies too much. So I looked it up, and I hope it's not as nefarious as it sounds, but he essentially started a compound in New Mexico, and they called it Shalom. It was in Las Cruces, New Mexico, him and this guy named Andrew Howland. And the weird part is they didn't proselytize, but what they did was try to collect babies. So they started this, they called it a receiving home in New Orleans, and they advertised it as babies wanted, no questions asked. Like, just drop your baby off. We'll take it.
Good night.
And his followers were called the Faithists. And they opened up receiving homes in Chicago, Philadelphia, and Kansas City. They didn't seem to be very successful at collecting kids. Social services visited. They had 12 kids on the compound. They were all around 8 years old. And they did say that they seemed to be happy and healthy. They were vegetarians. The kids had no shoes on and kind of linen tunics. And they were giving them 2 baths a day, which seemed odd to me. But also, it's in New Mexico. If you're running around barefoot, you might need 2 baths a day. But they said the kids were playing. They were skinny but healthy. But in, I think it was 1891, Newbrow died and Howland took over, and he got into some financial issues. And he put the deed in the kid's name, sued the kids to get the property back, and then put all the kids in orphanages.
Gosh, I had no idea about this part of Aaspi, by the way. All I knew about it was that I think Ray Palmer had been introduced to it by one of his writers, Rog Phillips, I believe. Certainly Rog Phillips pushed it in Amazing Stories as well. And then Palmer took the kind of ethereal, heavenly level to be where Shaver was really visiting. So he believed Shaver was having these encounters with these non-human beings, but he thought it was all ethereal in the astral plane or something. But I had no idea about this dark history about the founder of Aaspi.
And my family has a bad history of kind of like outer space cults. So up until 2008, the Mormon church was run by my family. Gordon Hinckley is
Get out of town.
Yeah. Gordon Hinckley and Newbrow are related, essentially. They're both direct descendants of Samuel Hinckley. So am I.
You should do a book on this. This would be fantastic.
And we got kicked out of England for being religious fanatics too. And that's how we ended up here to begin with.
That's a heck of a history, Susie. Do you think that's what's informed your interest in the weird going forward, perhaps? Or?
Well, so it's definitely my family's fault, no matter what way you spin it. So I got into Pukwudgies specifically because my dad is from Fall River, Mass, which is the southern tip of the Bridgewater Triangle. And when I was a kid, he grew up in a city, and we lived in the middle of nowhere. And he would use Pukwudgies as like the boogeyman. Like, don't go down near the swamp. The Pukwudgies will get you. Don't go too far in the woods. The Pukwudgies will get you, type of thing. And he was very much like an X-Files Star Trek guy. He'd actually had a UFO sighting in Vietnam when he was there. So I think that's what started his interest in the paranormal. He said on the plane when they were coming into Vietnam, they saw a big red ball of light over the wing of the plane. And then later on, when they were on the ground, they would see these red balls of lights kind of chasing the planes. He said that they looked intelligent, like they were playing with the planes almost. Wow. Yeah, he very much got me, Friday nights we'd watch X-Files, Unsolved Mysteries, things like that.
Those shows have a lot to answer for, both of them.
Yes, they do. And then 2013. And I had always thought Pukwudgies were something my dad just made up. I never knew there was any kind of folklore. This is like, before the internet, right?
Oh, wow.
So it wasn't until 2013, a documentary about the Bridgewater Triangle came out, and they talk about Pukwudgies on that. And I said, oh, my dad actually didn't make that up. So, I immediately start Googling. There wasn't much out there on them. So I said, I'll look into the Bridgewater Triangle in general more. And you can't look into the Bridgewater Triangle without looking into King Philip's War. And, every American should know about that. They, kind of gloss over it in school. It's just, the Pilgrims got here. There was the first Thanksgiving, and then, we don't know what happened. But there's, everyone should go out and learn about that.
I actually homeschool my daughter, and we did do King Philip's War this year.
Oh,
but tell people a little bit about it, because you're right. Most of our, just a brief overview, because it is quite formative to a lot of this stuff.
Yeah, so here's where my family comes into play again, which I found out by looking into Pukwudgies. The Pilgrims, essentially, Plymouth Colony, started pushing the Wampanoag tribe too far. They had come here and they had agreed a little bit, you can stay over here, we'll stay over here, we're cool. And then the Plymouth Colony kind of started to say, no, we want this land too. And it was actually a land dispute that kind of started. The tension reached a boiling point over that. And they massacred thousands of Wampanoag people and the Narragansett tribe also. So when I started looking into the Bridgewater Triangle, one of the stories is Anawan's Rock, which is a place where there's a lot of ghost sightings. And it was named after Chief Anawan. After they killed King Philip, who was Chief Metacomet, and King Philip was his English name, Chief Anawan took over. And the story is Benjamin Church went into the swamp, caught him at this rock where they were hiding, and said, we're not going to kill you. We're just going to bring you back to Plymouth. Let them, decide what to do, but your life will be spared if you just surrender. So they took him back to Plymouth Colony, and Benjamin Church had to leave to go somewhere else for a few days. And while Benjamin Church was gone, they beheaded him and put his head on a spike. So I'm reading this story about all the hauntings, and I said, well, what jerk did that to him? So I start looking into that more. It was my 7th great uncle.
Oh my goodness.
Yes. So now I think I've aired out all the family laundry in, just the last 15 minutes.
People have been saying how fascinating it is. Multiple people have been commenting. Catherine Forfeathers, who's a regular listener, viewer to the show. Vincent Richardson, who's back. Lots of people have been saying how great it is. No, it's absolutely fascinating. But you know what I thought we should do while we're in this region, because it's what we promised, is you probably know more about Pukwudgies than anybody else I know. So maybe some of our audience mightn't even know what the devil we're talking about when we're talking about Pukwudgies. So maybe you could fill them in.
Yeah. So people might not know the name, but I'm sure that everyone kind of knows the general folklore, because they have little people folklore all over the world. Every culture has its own version of it. Pukwudgies specifically are from the Northeast United States, Southeast Canada region. So New England, Great Lakes region, Quebec, all in there. It's Algonquin folklore, essentially. They're known to be tricksters. And in some areas known to be more dangerous than just harmful prank or harmless pranks. And that area is the Hockomock Swamp or Bridgewater Triangle area in Southeast Mass. It's kind of where the Cape meets the rest of the state. It's a little over an hour from me. They got a bad rap there, though. So every other area, the lore is, they'll hide your keys when you're late for work type of thing, right? In Hakamak, the lore is they will lure you off of a cliff to your death, type of thing.
It's a little bit different, hiding your keys or luring you to your death.
Yeah, but the thing is, when you hear of firsthand sightings, they're never dangerous. I mean, they're scary because you're seeing something strange, so people are naturally going to be a little freaked out. So I've actually been lucky enough to talk to some Wampanoag people about, why that is. And it turns out in 1934, this woman named Elizabeth Reynard wrote a book about the folklore of the Cape, and a Wampanoag historian, Chief Redshell, used Pukwudgies as an analogy for Europeans. So he was not actually saying that Pukwudgies killed people. He was saying that the Europeans killed people.
Fascinating.
But some of the things that they're said to do is they are shapeshifters. The ones here, they're all, about like 3 feet tall on average, but that can range anywhere from 2 to 4 feet, but we'll say 3 feet on average. The ones here are said to have smooth gray skin, have porcupine quills on their head and their back. The ones in the Midwest, so they're popular in Indiana, Ohio, Wisconsin. Those are the bowl cut Pukwudgies, I call them. So they have blonde hair that they wear in a bowl cut.
Huh.
They just have pointy ears that stick out. And those wear blue clothing. It's described as like a smock or a tunic usually. So they're a bit more refined out in the Midwest than we are here in New England with our Pukwudgies.
Huh. I would have thought it would be the other way around. I thought we would have been more frontier-esque than the good old stoic New Englanders. But there you go. Apparently that doesn't drift over to Pukwudgies.
Yeah. And so when I started looking into them, I was looking at it just like, cool local folklore. Didn't really think there was much more to it than that. But then when I spread out and I started looking at little people sightings in other areas too, there started to be some things that stuck out. Some of the commonalities are they're commonly seen with orbs of light. The Wampanoag call them Taipei Wonkas. It's very similar to the European will-o'-the-wisp. So a lot of the times people will see a light first that will kind of lead them to the creature. And that is popular not just in Hakamak, but in Indiana and other regions also. The other thing is Thunderbird sightings. Everywhere that you have little people sightings, you have Thunderbird sightings. Bigfoot,
wow.
Bigfoot too. And they all seem to be near both water, burial grounds, and some source of electricity. So in Hakamak, there's like these huge high tension power lines that run all the way through it. There's been a rash of sightings in Illinois near a nuclear power plant. So, I mean, that seems to be the recipe to get a Pukwudgie sighting.
A few people have commented now in the chat. I mean, I rewind through a bunch, but Bob Antone, a good friend of mine and a regular guest on the show as well, made the point of saying that they have something similar out, and he's in the kind of Pacific Northwest area. So it's interesting that these things do, and I know that's part of your research as well, that these things do tend to have commonalities, perhaps not even just through this country, but do you find similarities with, for example, fairy faith in Ireland and other countries as well?
I think fae and little people are one and the same, possibly, if not close cousins. At first, I've actually thought that maybe the Europeans brought their folklore with them to New England. But if you ask any of the indigenous people here, they'll say, no, we had those before. So I think we have to kind of rule that one out. But there are, I mean, it's always mischievous little people. They're just little tricksters in any region of the world. You have it. You have the duendes in South and Central America, the Philippines as well. Pukwudgies don't have this trait, but I have found a lot of different cultures their little people wear red pointy hats. So you have that in Scandinavia, you have that in Mexico, and you have that in the Philippines. And those are all very random places. And this is very old folklore. So it's just very strange that they have that common trait in these places that, you know, weren't neighboring and didn't have communication.
We have an interesting question from Horace Smith that always has interesting questions. He's been a guest on this show as well. He's also the emeritus professor of astronomy and physics at Michigan State University. And he asks, what were they associated with before power lines, going back to something we were talking about earlier?
Yeah, so they were always associated with burial grounds. Hockomock Swamp in the Bridgewater Triangle they have found remains in there that are up to 8,000 years old. Hockomock actually means place where the spirits dwell. And then in Indiana, you see them at Mound State Park. The ones in Indiana specifically, they're supposed to show up right before a thunderstorm. And I think somebody just mentioned storms too. But that was, you know, essentially the lightning was the electricity element beforehand. But they were believed to be like protectors of burial grounds by indigenous people.
It's interesting how weather plays a part in a lot of paranormal phenomena. And something you said before about, I think, closeness to water or the things with water also made me think about missing 411. But when you start to talk about weather, David Paulides is always talking about how so many of the cases, and one of the case points that he sees again and again, is strange weather comes in when people disappear shortly afterwards. Have you seen any, in your research, has there been anything regarding Pukwudgies or things like Pukwudgies or any of the many things you've researched where you've seen some crossover with missing people?
There's actually, in the Hockomock region, Pukwudgies are said to make people disappear specifically. They're known to kind of lure you deeper into the swamp. They're said to cause confusion, and they're blamed for people going missing. But that's kind of like a friend of a friend type of thing. I mean, I don't know what proof we would have if someone went missing and it was a Pukwudgie's fault. So, I mean, if you're missing, you're not there to tell about the sighting. But that is like the general lore in the area.
Huh. I mean, certainly there seems to be throughout the lore of fair faith that people, like the traditional Irish, idea of fairy faith, the idea that people disappear who have contact with those beings. So I'm not surprised that whether it was somehow imported culturally along with people who came here, or whether it's a similar phenomenon which, works on different sides of the planet or on different continents, that there does seem to be some connection with missing time and missing people with diminutive beings.
Yeah, stealing babies is another commonality.
Mm-hmm.
The Ojibwa tribe, their Pukwudgies are said to steal babies from bad parents specifically.
Huh.
Which, I mean, good on them for only stealing them from the bad parents. I guess if you're one of the parents, it's not so great. And in the Ohio River Valley region, it said that if you witness one and you tell somebody you saw it, that you could potentially disappear or have very bad luck. I've heard both iterations of it.
Interesting. Because that's part of fairy faith as well, that you're not meant to talk about seeing the little people or the good neighbors or the other crowd or whatever we want to call it. Is there anything like changeling stories in, because you said that they take away the children from bad parents? Do they ever leave their own offspring?
No, but there is a weird legend in Hockomock, which is they will steal women to reproduce with.
Oh.
So I don't know if that plays in it at all, or what a Pukwudgie human hybrid would look like. Danny DeVito, maybe.
I hazard to think, although, you know what, speaking about commonalities with fairy faith, of course, that's quite a common tradition in fairy lore, that human women and sometimes human men would be taken as lovers by the fair folk.
And aliens too, right? You have
absolutely,
you know, that type of thing as well with them.
I think it's something that ufology didn't used to like to talk about, but I remember when I met the late great Jim Moseley many years ago now, back in like 99, I think it was at Clearwater, Florida, at a UFO conference. I'd arranged to meet him. That the thing that Moseley was most interested in talking about was sex with the space people, because he had stories going back to the 1950s. And of course, this idea of some kind of supernatural or paranormal coupling underpins so much of folklore, and it underpinned much of UFO belief as well. I don't think your average scientific nuts and bolts ufologist could get on board until it was kind of de-eroticized, until it kind of became like a Betty and Barney Hill thing, or like a Whitley Strieber communion thing, where it seemed like the aliens were experimenting on us like animals. But there was also, of course, in the contactee lore, lots of stories about Earthlings developing romantic relationships with the Space Brothers, just like in fairy folklore. There were lots of tales about people having romantic relationships with the other crowd.
Yeah, I mean, my personal belief is that aliens, fae, little people are at least from the same place or the same type of energy, and just, different manifestations. They're always, tricksters. They're always seen with these balls of light. They disappear and they reappear. And, it's different, but it's similar enough that you can make connections there. Getting abducted by a Pukwudgie versus getting abducted by an alien or UFO pilot, there's not too much of a difference in even the way they look, really.
I'm going to come back to you on that, because that's something we could talk about for the rest of the show, because I'm fascinated by it. But we do have a question from Vincent Richardson, and he says, do you feed Pukwudgies or leave them gifts?
Traditionally, you leave them a basket specifically full of fruit and or cigars. The Mohegan tribe in Connecticut, they called their little people the Makiawesugs. And there are still people in the area that before they go out in the woods, they'll leave a cigar at the base of a tree or hang a basket full of fruit off of a tree branch.
Oh, wow. And that travels across a lot of the type of different cultures as well. The idea that even we still, in some ways, follow some of those things today. Much of trick-or-treating is the idea that you left things out for the dead, and that, or the fair folk, or the things that might come through. And so it might now remain as childish superstition in some cultural ways, but the memory, I think, is there. But I have to get back to what you were talking about a minute ago when you were comparing like being abducted by Pukwudgies or aliens, same really. What's your take on these things? Do you think they're the same thing? Do you think they're manifestations from a similar force? Do you think there's just some kind of cultural interpretation that we put on the beings? Where do you actually stand when it comes to, say, aliens here and Pukwudgies here?
So I'd call them all ultra terrestrials. They seem to come through in what I've always called thin spots. I think Keel called them window areas.
That's right.
And I just, to preface this, I don't believe in Native American curses at all. I think that's, just a lazy excuse. We know weird stuff was happening before King Philip's War and all of that. But you have these sightings near burial places, and people that are more connected to the land might want to bury their dead in a place where it's easier for them to cross back and forth. So wherever energy goes or comes from, I think it's all coming from the same place through the same means of manifestation. And you have weird coincidences. Like I talked about the balls of light, but there's also high-pitched noises often heard right before a sighting. And you have that with other phenomena across the world too. And in Hockomock, the balls of light are usually red, but then they'll cycle through colors. And Keel actually talked about that in the 8th Tower, because before you have red, you have infrared in the spectrum.
Right.
Which people can't see, but some dogs can. And a lot of Pukwudgie sightings start with somebody walking their dog and the dog notices it first. And I think it's either the infrared or the frequency of the tone. It's trying to manifest. It has to kind of go through the spectrum to become physical. So, I mean, there's something there where they're coming from, why they're here. I don't think I'll ever understand the motives of a non-human creature. Can barely understand the motives of other humans. So that one I'm not going to try too hard on. But there's something there with it for sure, in my opinion.
I think what you said points to what I've always considered being one of the better explanations for everything weird. It mightn't just be that the fair folk and the extraterrestrials are the same under different cultural examination or different cultural interpretation. It might be that everything that it punches into this reality, which we can't explain, from Bigfoot to the Loch Ness Monster to aliens and Pukwudgies and fairies in between, are all emanating from some similar root source. Now, on a more prosaic explanation than that, which Hair Force One asks, which is a legitimate question, because I know there was a cultural anthropologist or a number of them that suggested the fair folk in Ireland might be from a similar type of memory or a similar origin. And he asks, do you think Pukwudgies may be little people exiled from tribes way back when and maybe slightly misinterpreted or lost in translation, which is similar to what people suggested about perhaps the fairies were a pre-Gaelic tribe that when the Gaels invaded were kind of pushed further into the woodlands or pushed literally further underground to escape the animosity of the new invaders. So I guess that's an alternative, I suppose, interpretation.
Yeah, and you have the same problem there that you have with Bigfoot. No bodies, no physical evidence. But we still have sightings today. I just interviewed Bill Russo last week. He has one of the most infamous Pukwudgie sightings. He actually spoke, or one spoke to him, I should say.
Huh. What did it say?
It said, Iwan Chu, Kia. And it was going like this to him. And very high-pitched voice. It's on my YouTube channel, which you can get a link to in my blog. He does a better impression than me. I can't do it justice. But he said it was trying to get him to come closer. He thinks it was saying, "We want you. Come here, come here." And trying to speak English.
That's very fairy-esque as well, trying to draw you into the other realm, and you're probably never going to go home.
They're very into luring people. They're not going to chase you. They're going to try to convince you to go somewhere with them.
That's terrifying. And we hear stories about people in the woods and the forests hearing voices and sometimes there's I've heard, I'm trying to think of an example and I can't, but I know I've heard of a number of stories of people thinking they've heard like a friend or a loved one called them.
In the Appalachians, or Appalachia region of the country, you're not supposed to react if you hear your name called after dark. I don't think they have it attached to a specific entity, but it's just like in the area, you don't whistle at night. And if you hear someone call your name, don't look, just keep going. That's terrifying. Like the whole doppelganger type thing. Because, it is said to be the voice of someone, that's very, when you can't see what it is, it's scary too. Bill Russo actually just told me a story of someone that was in Freetown State Forest, which is part of the Bridgewater Triangle. And they had gotten, I believe it was a Ford Bronco, and they were, just kind of taking it off road to see what it could do. It was a summer night and they were having fun. And all of a sudden the engine turned off. It wouldn't start back up again. And they hear rocks hitting the side of the vehicle. And they're coming from like every single direction. And they still couldn't get it started. They have these rocks being thrown at them from they don't know where. So they're stuck in the middle. And this was before cell phones, so they couldn't like call for help. So they had to walk back to the road. But it was, pitch black. And they actually they saw headlights coming towards them, but at a high speed. And right as whatever those headlights belonged to was about to hit them, it just disappeared. And because it was pitch black, no moon out, nothing, they had to take their clothes off and wrap them around a stick to make a torch and walk back like that. And they made it out fine. I don't know if they got the Bronco back out of the woods. There is a large amount of abandoned vehicles in that area.
Gosh. So now I'm interested because you're obviously so well versed in so much of this. I know your family background, but what pointed you in the type of Keelian direction of this type of broader interpretation of everything, perhaps emanating, from something similar? Was it reading Keel himself, or was it reading something else, or was it experiences, or what pushed you that way?
It was ThunderBirds. When I started to notice the ThunderBird sightings in the same areas, everyone kept telling me, you have to read Mothman Prophecies. And it was our mutual friend, Steve Ward, who said,
great.
He knew the chapter off the top of his head, probably the page number.
Probably.
So I had to go and check out what he said about ThunderBirds. Because, at that point I was like full blown into researching ThunderBirds. And it was a sighting in the Bridgewater Triangle reported by a police officer that made me kind of think there was more to it. And that sighting was almost more Mothman-like than bird. He actually thought it was a person at first. He was driving late at night. He saw a dark figure on the side of the road. And then when he got closer, it just wings erupted and it went straight up into the air. So birds aren't known to go straight up in the air. And it was obviously humanoid. He thought it was a hitchhiker at first.
That'd be a shock. You pull it over for a hitchhiker and psh, up he shoots.
Yep. And he went back to the police station and reported it. And, was the laughing stock of that police department. But then people in that same area said, well, yeah, we see it all the time. Like, it's an everyday thing for them. They just see that ginormous bird man constantly.
Good. And so then that kind of was your segue into the I don't know, the paraphysical type explanation for all of these things.
Yeah, and it was kind of like an identity crisis reading Mothman prophecies for me.
Oh, I know. I read it. I was there with you.
Yep. And it was comforting that other people have thought the same things as me before. But at the same time, it's like, I thought I came up with that. But nope, Keel was ahead of it.
Oh, so you were ahead of me. I mean, for me, it was an identity crisis that I already believed a lot of this stuff was nuts and bolts ufology, which was what I was interested in. So Mothman prophecies made me have to reassess everything. So I wasn't quite. I hadn't worked it out already. It was literally John Keel's. It was literally the Mothman prophecies that.
Yeah,
made
I was
me go,
not.
Something else is happening here than what I thought.
No interest in anything nuts and bolts, flesh and blood like that. Of course there's animals we don't know exist in the woods. Of course there's beings from other planets. I don't know if they come here or not, but that's definitely, boring. And I kind of wrote off a lot of things because of that, because they just weren't interesting to me. I don't know why. It's just not like, Bigfoot, now that I know more about it, and UFOs, now that I know more about them, very interesting. But when you're posing it as, like Martians coming down the spaceship, I'm like, okay.
It's funny because when you enter the space that you've taken and the space that I've taken and the space Steve Ward and other people here has taken, it often positions you in direct opposition to whatever field your interest might be. Like if it's UFOs, I do think things are changing a little bit now, that said. But if it's UFOs and you don't think it's from outer space, then you're kind of sidelined. If it's Bigfoot and you don't think it's a physical hairy hominid running around hiding in the woodlands of North America, you're kind of sidelined. If it's ghosts and you don't think it's really great dear old Aunt Edna in the side wing of the family estate, you're sidelined. So it was kind of this unpopular, and it still is, I think, in many ways, still this weird, unpopular place to be.
Yeah, when I first started getting really into research, I found forums and groups. I was, virtually chased with pitchforks for even proposing the idea. People are much more open to it now, but even just, a couple of years ago, it was real rough to even get the conversation started.
Have you noticed, and it's something obviously because I've particularly focused on UFO belief more than anything else, but what I found fascinating recently is that some heavy hitters in the space, from I guess Hal Puthoff to even David Grush, the whistleblower, to Tom DeLonge, the ex Blink 182, now head of To the Stars Academy. So many people in this disclosure space. Leslie Kean's another example, the co-author of the New York Times article that broke the whole, the UFO story, made it respectable again in 2017. So many people. Tucker Carlson's another example. Not that he's a ufologist, but he's a person in the press who's always followed these things, whether you like his politics or not. So many people now seem to be in the kind of upper echelons as saying it's not extraterrestrial. And I don't know if the grassroots have caught up with that yet, but it seems to be that a lot of, the movers and shakers of the disclosure movement. Look at that. I don't know why balloons got released when I did this.
It's the Darrows.
It is the damn Tampa. Where are the Taros? Stop the Daros shooting me with the Tampa rays. Have you noticed that? Have you noticed there seems to be the upper echelon again of the disclosure movement seem to be saying that this isn't extraterrestrial?
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. I've noticed that.
It's weird. Like, I don't know why. I'm paranoid, so I don't know if there's an agenda all of a sudden, but why are the people at the front of the disclosure movement now saying? Is it because they actually know, or is it because there's a new talking point coming down? Because nobody was talking like Keel, who was in that position. Like, if you go back to the Condon Committee days and you go back to like the people, Donald Kehoe and people, rattling at the Air Force's doors back in the 50s through the 60s, nobody was saying this thing isn't ET. They were all saying it's ET and we know it is. And now people are saying we know it's not ET. It's very strange.
It's, it's scarier when it is an ultra terrestrial. I would even blame my, family's business and cults on that. I mean, you have this pattern of experiencers kind of being tricked and misled. They're always tricksters, and they kind of get groomed. I have no proof, but there's patterns of that, over time. Keel talks about it. It just makes so much sense. If you see a humanoid figure with wings and you are a religious person, you might interpret that as an angel. Whereas, someone else who isn't might think that's a scary beast, the same exact thing. So, I mean, your beliefs will color what you experience. You could have, 3 people with different beliefs witness the same thing and they all get something else out of it. So, like I said before, I'll never know why they're here, how they're here, but that something's here for sure.
What experiences have you had? I mean, outside your tales and your family and being obviously very conscious of how weird things are from an early age, have you had direct experiences with the paranormal? Do you have regular experiences with anything anomalous?
So I've always said no, I don't. I'm starting to reevaluate that statement. I have a lot of weird coincidences in my life, a lot of synchronicities. And people tell you when you have synchronicities, it means you're on the right path. I don't know if I believe that or not, because it always kind of makes me a little suspicious. Maybe this is a path somebody wants me to go down. But I've also had dreams of things that I shouldn't have been able to know about. And I think I had mentioned it before when we were talking. I had dreams of recurring nightmares. And it was always in the same house in my hometown. And in the dream, I go to leave and the transmission in my car is gone. Just dream logic. I don't know how it happens. But the lady that lives at this house, instead of helping me, she starts screaming at me, telling me I'm stuck there. I have to stay. After several times of having the same nightmare, I called my mom, who I call and, ask when I have a weird thing theory about anything. And she said, that's the house your grandmother grew up in. And that woman you described sounds like your great grandmother. So she sent me pictures of both the house and my great grandmother, and it was her. And looking into it, there were things I never knew. Like my grandmother she seemed to have rushed to get out of the house. They didn't have a good relationship. And we think that my great grandmother disowned her because she got pregnant before she was married, is what I found out from from looking up birth records of my aunts. So, I mean, it's not paranormal, but it's weird. I've had a lot of weird things happen.
Yeah, that's interesting, because I wonder how often the anomalous touches us, or whether you want to look at it as paranormal or supernatural, or if you want to look at it as something from Keel super spectrum, whatever, the things which aren't our everyday physical positivistic experiences hits us, and maybe we're too plugged into our phones, or too plugged into thinking about that we have to make the kids dinner, or that we're late for work, and we actually miss these things and they just slip on by.
Yeah, and back to the Pukwudgies with dog sightings. Part of me too wonders, are we just walking past them all the time when we have our headphones in, or we're looking at our phones?
Yeah, I mean, I sometimes I wonder if the more violent is a loaded word, but times when the anomalous burst into people's reality, whether it's a Bigfoot pounding on a cabin door, or whether it's, something standing by your bed at night and taking you somewhere else. I wonder if sometimes that's the anomalous, desperate to get our attention because we've been so demystified in this modern age that we don't engage with it at all. And sometimes it wants to say, we're still here. We haven't gone. Look
Yeah.
around.
Yeah. And actually, the time I was having those nightmares was a time I needed to be reminded of that. So that's very possible in my situation, at least.
Yeah, it wouldn't surprise me. I think the world is far weirder, hence talking weird, than most people ever are comfortable to admit. Maybe not outside of our, the broader community that we're talking to and talking within tonight. But so what are you doing going forward? Like, I know you have a number of research projects. So what are you up to at the moment, Susy?
Yeah. So part of the reason why I started to become more active is because of the misinformation out there. I've been seeing it more and more recently. There's people going out into the Hockomock swamp with an EMF detector that goes wild when they get next to the high tension power lines.
Right.
And I've seen other ones with like an SLS camera that is being set off because of the branches on bushes outside.
Right.
And then there's just they have this bad reputation, like stay away from them. They're evil. They're bad. I don't personally believe anything is evil. If you're watching a nature documentary that's filmed from the perspective of the mouse, the hawk that swoops down and grabs it is going to be the bad guy. The same scene is filmed from the perspective of the starving hawk. You're cheering him on when he catches that mouse. So, everyone's out there saying, it's a Native American curse. They're evil. They're bad. And they just aren't. Like, it's just, there's very few things that we can tell for sure, but it's not a curse from King Philip's War because they've been here longer than that. And I just think it's harmful to the Wampanoag tribe, to put that on them. And it stings when you're trying to research too, because you have to sift through all this junk. And also, like, for other people researching other things too, it's helpful to have the data out there and make the connections. So what I've been doing is, so my day job is corporate finance. So I'm a numbers nerd. I like my spreadsheets. So what I'm doing is I'm compiling sightings into a spreadsheet to make it easier to find commonalities and make connections there. Can throw data in a graph. It's much easier to kind of digest, and like that, the Thunderbirds, I might not have ever have noticed. Bigfoot too, if I wasn't, logging everything in that spreadsheet. So right now I'm focusing on taking new sightings, if you Google it, there's not a lot out there. But then when you talk to people, they'll say, "Oh, I've seen one of those. I didn't know what it was called." And then you get a lot like, I can't go to work and tell people I saw a little dwarf in the woods. They'd think I was crazy.
Do you have people reach out to you, or do you look for sightings yourself, or how do you determine the data that goes into the spreadsheets?
So I have people reach out. There is a way on my blog to report a sighting, or people contact me on Facebook a lot because I'm always there talking about Pukwudgies. I've also scoured the internet, gone through old newspaper clippings, any way I can find them, and I kind of try to vet them a little bit myself and look for other weird phenomena in that area too. And it's always there. There's always something else weird where there's little people.
I can't say how much fun I had talking to you tonight. You were a delightful guest. The chat was just so active. People were just hanging on every word you said. How do people now check out what you're doing? Can you throw out some URLs or point them to where they can check out your research, or anywhere you want them to look?
Yeah, pukwudgies.blogspot.com is my blog. There's a contact form there. The best way to reach me is on Facebook, Susy Bastille on Facebook. If you had questions that we didn't get to, feel free. I will talk Pukwudgies with you all day.
Well, we'll have to have you back to talk Pukwudgies and other things sometime in the very near future, because again, you were fantastic. Thank you so much for joining me tonight, Susy. You were a great guest.
You're very welcome. My pleasure.
And until I get to chat to you again, until I get to chat to everybody else out there, keep it weird.